Is life ultimately meaningless if God does not exist? Dr. William Lane Craig says yes, and he explains why in this popular YouTube video on his YouTube channel. My guest, Dr. Tim Mawson, says the answer is no. Even if God does not exist, life is not ultimately meaningless. Dr. Mawson is a professor of philosophy at Oxford University, and he's an expert on the topic of the relationship between God and the meaning of life. I invited Dr. Mawson on and played clips from Dr. Craig's video, and he offered commentary on those clips. In his commentary, you're going to hear why he thinks Dr. Craig has overstated his case. So let's get started.
I did think, before we started, that there was a bit of standard terminology due to contemporary philosopher Thaddeus Metz, standard terminology in literature, which might be helpful to locate Craig's view and to locate my own. So according to that, there's a view called extreme supernaturalism, which is the view that without God and immortality, then life is completely meaningless, totally absurd. And that seems to be Craig's view. He's defended it here in this video. And in a piece which is freely available online, that is to say, available without charge, free online, this absurdity of life without God, which the video closely follows. And moderate supernaturalism is the view that without God and an afterlife, life is less meaningful, but not completely meaningless. And that's my view. And that's the view I've defended in writing at most length in my 2016 book, God and the Meanings of Life. And then there's a view which you could call by different names. And it's the view that God and an afterlife wouldn't add at all to the meaning of life. They're just irrelevant. Or maybe that they'd even detract from it. And that would be Sartre's view. And Sartre gets a mention right at the end of this video. And I do discuss Sartre's view at some length in my book, although being a moderate supernaturalist, I reject his view, just as I reject Craig's view, which is the extreme view. And so as I comment, you'll find that I'm going to dissent from Craig somewhat. And in essence, I think he's rather just over-egged his cake, as it were. So I think there's some truth in what he said. But if atheism is true, things aren't quite as bad as he seems to suggest. So that's going to be my basic take-home message.
Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? In the name of progress, modern man has tried to answer those questions without reference to God. But the answers that came back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that in killing God, he had freed himself from everything that repressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had unwittingly killed himself.
Craig starts by saying that modern man has tried to answer certain questions without reference to God. And well, very broad brush, I think Craig is right that some people have tried to think about the answer to these questions without reference to God. And as a matter of the history of ideas, that was a less popular activity before modernity, whenever you think that started, before modernity came along. But slightly less broad brush, I think it would be fair to say that some people were trying to answer these questions without reference to God long before modernity, whenever that started. I think in the written version of the piece, it's clearly has in mind the Enlightenment there. So Lucretius, for example. And then, of course, there's Craig, amongst others, who are trying to answer these questions without not referring to God, i.e. with reference to God even since then. So it'd be rather broad brush to say that modern man did this, pre-modern man did this, and now modern man is doing this. But then it's a 5-minute video. There's a limit to how nuanced one can be. And as one goes on, it's pretty clear that he has in mind with modern man certain existentialist thinkers. So Nietzsche isn't explicitly mentioned in the video, but the notion of killing God, you may remember, is used. We're told that modern man, whoever he, she, or they are, modern man has killed God, but has discovered that in killing God, he's unwittingly killed himself. Now, I confess I don't know quite what Craig means by that, but it's obviously some figurative expression of the thought that modern man has got terribly dissatisfied with the answers that he's given to the questions, absent reference to God. But I take it that if I directed a thought to that like that to some Nietzsche, they just reject it. They'd say something like, well, by killing God, that is ceasing to believe that God exists. That's the truth that's a figurative expression of. By ceasing to believe that God exists, I haven't actually killed myself. I've liberated myself. I've enlivened myself. I've sloughed off all sorts of life-denying presuppositions that afflict those who, in their benighted ways, still struggle on under the illusion that there's a God out there. So they may be wrong about that. I happen to believe, as Craig happens to believe, they are wrong about that. But I think it would be wrong to say that they've discovered that for themselves. They were in blissful ignorance, most Nietzscheans, about their condition, and they wouldn't describe it in the way that Craig describes it. So, okay, he might assess them as having missed the point. but they wouldn't do that.
For if God does not exist, man's life is ultimately absurd. If God does not exist, then man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Like all biological organisms, man must die. His life is but a spark in the infinite darkness, a spark that appears, flickers, and then dies forever. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding, and as it does so, it grows colder and colder. Eventually, there will be no heat at all. There will be no light. There will be no life. This is not science fiction. If God does not exist, then we are inevitably doomed to extinction. Now, what does all this imply? It means that life itself is absurd. It means that the life we do have is ultimately without meaning, value, or purpose. If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, what ultimate significance can be assigned to his life? His life might be important relative to certain other events, but if all of the events are ultimately meaningless, what can be the ultimate significance of influencing any of them? Mankind is thus no more ultimately significant than a swarm of mosquitoes, for their end is all the same.
So we then get to Craig's sort of central claim, I take it, which is that if God doesn't exist, man's life is ultimately absurd. And there's some stuff about the heat death of the universe, which he puts in there. It's not universally agreed that, he says this is science, it's not science fiction. And indeed, it is science and it is the conventional view. But it's not universally agreed that the science does point in the direction of heat death. But okay, we can accept that there'll be a heat death. It doesn't actually make a difference as long as you accept that at some stage, each of us as individuals and each of us, when we sum ourselves together and think of ourselves collectively as humanity, will, as a matter of fact, cease. There's still our lives individually and our life collectively are finite in the forwards direction. And that's the premise he really needs. He doesn't actually need the stuff about the heat death, although if the heat death is the right account, it gives him that. So we'll just accept that. And the question is asked, well, what does this imply? I think I've jotted down. What does all this imply, he says? And then he answers it. Well, he said that it implies that our lives are without meaning, value, or purpose. So I think there's a lot run together there. And I think there's something in it. But as I said at the start, I think it's a bit overcooked. As I say, Craig's is quite an extreme view on what the atheist can only in consistency say. Mine is a more moderate view. It seems to me that there's, and to others, that there's ambiguity in the phrase man's life. So does he mean the lives of us each considered individually, a man's life, or each of us individually? Or does he mean humanity, the species life as such? And I think he means both. He means both each of us individually and all of us collectively. And that's why he talks about our deaths, i.e. the deaths of us as individuals, and our species death, which will come in the heat death of the universe, if not before. But we might want to separate those out and think about them separately. And if we were to do so, then I suggest that we probably think that it's our individual lives that we're going to care about most. So we'd say that if, and now of course Craig would deny this antecedent, but we might say that if it were to be true that each of our individual lives could have a lot of meaning in them individually, well, then the fact that humanity's life as such wouldn't have meaning or value or purpose, the aggregate that we constitute doesn't have this property. But as long as each of us individually were able to have this property, maybe that wouldn't matter. In fact, we'd think it wouldn't matter. Now, Craig might say, no, you can't have that. If there's meaningless, as I put it in my writing, sometimes at the top level, then that sort of spreads down, the fish rots from the head. It spreads down and makes each of our individual lives meaningless. But that's an interesting claim, and it's not clear to everyone that it's true, and it's not clear to me that it's true, and it's not clear to many atheists that it's true either. So a move that's pretty standard in the atheistic literature is to say, look, Craig, I'm not aware of an atheist saying this to Craig, but to say, look to someone like Craig, you've got to distinguish between these two. And then to concede that, sure, life in the sense of humanity's life, species life, yeah, that doesn't have any meaning, purpose. It doesn't have any of that. But our lives as individual lives can have meaning, value, and purpose. So even though the aggregate life we all make up doesn't have meaning or purpose, our individual lives can have it. And then some say, and probably if our individual lives do have it, probably that that property of value does aggregate up, so that humanity as such has value, albeit temporary value. Humanity as such probably doesn't have purpose, but our individual lives can have purpose, and humanity as such probably doesn't have meaning, but our individual lives can have meaning. So there's quite a lot of action going on there where people will concede, if you like, that humanity's life as such doesn't have meaning, but deny that has an implication that our individual lives don't have meaning and inflected by value and purpose. And I think we want to think a little bit about what Craig means by meaning, purpose, because, or at least some understandings of these terms, we individually can have all three: meaning, value, and purpose, even if we're individually going to die. And that'll be the end of us. Humanity at some point will also cease to exist. So we could talk about some possible meanings of meaning, value, and purpose, and what might follow on those. If we start with meaning first, then you could say, well, one perfectly serviceable sense of meaning is such that an individual's life has meaning just if he, she, or they happens to feel a certain sort of endorsement towards it as they consider it in their reflective moments. So they say, regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I wouldn't change anything in the broad pattern of my life. I've had a good life. Imagine someone on their deathbed who's asked if they could go back in time. And the worst thing is that I renewed that subscription to some magazine that in the end I never read. Or like, oh, great. So how do you feel about your life? And there's a certain sort of feeling there which you might capture as saying, oh, they feel that their life's meaningful. And psychologists study meaning of life. And when they do study it, it becomes clear, although sadly they seldom clearly define what they mean. It becomes they mean subjective felt satisfaction towards one's life in that sort of, with regard to its large-scale theme. So you can niggle away at, I don't like this bit, I don't like that bit. But as long as on balance you would, on reflection, wish to lead your life as you're leading it, you've got meaning in that sense. And we can obviously do have that, and atheists have it, and we can obviously have it. I mean, if there's not a God, then we seem to likely to have it as much as if there is. It may be that those who are religious have more of that feeling than those who don't, but it's clear that some atheists are pretty self-satisfied, if you like. And so I think Craig would say, sure, that's true, but that's just subjective meaning. That's not ultimate meaning. So he's very keen, isn't he, to say, talk about things being ultimately meaningful. And I'm sure it could have relative, but I'm talking about it. So I think he'd admit that we can have that, but just say that's not the type of meaning he's talking about. And then value, which you also mentioned. Well, clearly there's also a subjective sense of value, which seems to me to make perfect sense. Something valuable in an individual's life just if he, she, or they happens to value it. So it might be valuable to me that my front room be painted a particular colour rather than some other colour. But I wouldn't wish to say that there was anything objectively better about my choice of colour than one that my wife might have picked out had she had. So, but it's very important to me that this be done this way. And so now that I have managed to paint it the colour I want it, something of value subjectively has come into the world as a result of my activity, and I can take a certain sort of pleasure in that. And again, I think Craig would say, oh, yeah, sure, yeah, it can have some subjective value, but I was talking about objective value. But it seems to me, and here I think I'm going to part company with Craig, that an individual's life can have objective value, even if they're going to die, and that'll be the end of them. It may be that that nothing can have objective value if God doesn't exist, because Craig may be right in his understanding of how best to solve the Euthyphro dilemma, which I'm sure your listeners and viewers are familiar with. But Craig has the view that God is needed to underwrite to generate objective value. So if there is no God, well, then there is no objective value, so there's no objective value for people to get in touch with. But that's a controversial premise, which he hasn't at all made explicit or even implicit in what he said here. And without that, if you were to say, be a Platonist about value and think, well, even in logically possible but not metaphysically possible universes, if God exists, even in logically possible universes where there is no God, there can still be objective value. And then I think it's very consistent to say, and a lot of atheists would say that that's the type of universe we're in. When I think it's very consistent to say we can engage with that objective value. So if we take this is, I'm going to reference her, but I'm not going to talk about the video in which she appears much. But so if we take Mother Teresa, someone, for example, someone who Craig explicitly lauds later on, and I think rightly so. If you think that Mother Teresa wasn't all she was cracked up to be, then you can substitute your own particular hero or heroine in, for the example there, Christopher Hitchens, maybe, if you're a fan of him. Anyway, he says, Mother Teresa, in her life, we think, well, she performed actions which had objective value in the world during her earthly life. She brought a certain amount of good into the world, helped a certain number of people and so on. And it seems to me an atheist who isn't can say, well, okay, she had that, as it were, in the bank by the time she died, however much good she'd done. That was an amount she'd accomplished during her life. And even if nothing happened after her death was the end of her, that wouldn't make the value of her life, whatever amount of good she managed to produce, to do, any less. If in the heat death of the universe, all of humanity is going to be erased, that doesn't, as it were, reach back in time and erase the value of all that's happened prior to then in history. And purpose as well. You remember you said meaning, value, and purpose. Well, again, surely Mother Teresa's life had purpose in the sense that she did, as a matter of fact, devote it to showing people compassion. And again, that can't be retrospectively taken away from her if she dies and her death is the end, or humanity ceases to exist. She still had that purpose to whatever extent she did during her earthly life, even if her earthly life was all that there was. So it seems to me that not all of meaning, value, and purpose is absent if death is the end. And I do think, hence, as implied by your question, to be defensible, Craig must say, well, it's only a particular sort of meaning. Let's call it ultimate meaning, a particular sort of value. Let's call it, if I call it objective value, then I'm going to need to put my solution to the Euthyphro dilemma onto the table and convince you that it's the only possible solution. So, okay, a bit of fudging needed here, but let's say some sort of absolute ultimate value. And purpose, okay, not subjective purposes you or others, mundane people might assign to you, because I can have a purpose that I don't assign to myself. I perform a job, a function at my college. I mean, I freely acquiesce to that purpose and I signed the contract to do it, but there's a purpose which is assigned me by my employer, which I acquiesce to rather than what I've just come up with ex nihilo, as it were. But subjective purpose or intersubjective purpose, okay, we can have that, Craig might say, but there's something that's out there. I mean, in my writings, I call it ultimate significance meaning that we can't have absent a certain religious character. But I think in this video, the thing I'm a little bit more grumpy about in the sense with him is that he doesn't make it clear that he can't say, look, all on any atheistic presumptions, all meaning of all types, value of all types, purpose of all types is completely washed out. Craig might say, well, hang on, come on, my moral argument for the existence of God, which has as one of its premises that objective value cannot exist if God doesn't exist. So therefore, if you say, well, I don't believe that God exists, I think I can already show you, Mr. Atheist or Mrs. Atheist or Ms. Atheist or whatever, I think I can already show you that you've got an incoherence there. So if we have to bracket it and assume he's not successful in that, and he might say, well, that's not a fair assumption to make because I think my argument is really good. That's why I keep putting it forward whenever I get the chance. All right. But if that wasn't the case, and we're talking to an atheist who says, I think there can be, and many atheists do this, I think in like a secular moral philosophy, the predominant position amongst meta-ethicists nowadays is some sort of realism, some sort of objectivism, and they don't think that they're committed by that to the existence of God. So if you say, okay, atheists, I'm going to allow that you can in consistency say you're in a universe in which there is objective value, then you might say, well, okay, if I've allowed that, then surely I should allow that if an atheist comes along or an atheist, anyone comes along and generate some purposes which link in an appropriate way with that objective value. So perhaps I decide, you know what, I'm going to build a hospital for needy people in Calcutta, say, following Mother Teresa's fine example. And then I do it and so on and so forth. So I've assigned myself a purpose and I fulfill that purpose. The outcome of the purpose is achieved in my life. The hospital comes into existence. Well, then I have engaged in an objectively purposeful way with objective value, and my life has had purpose, and indeed the outcome has been achieved before I die. So what's the problem, Craig? So that will certainly be a response that some atheists would make.
If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, what ultimate significance can be assigned to his life? His life might be important relative to certain other events, but if all of the events are ultimately meaningless, what can be the ultimate significance of influencing any of them? Mankind is thus no more ultimately significant than a swarm of mosquitoes, for their end is all the same. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he ultimately is nothing.
He's got a lot in his 5 minutes, but I don't agree with all of it. Because he ends in nothing, he ultimately is nothing. And then there's a sort of visual cue provided by the video to suggest that, well, one might well take up smoking or wandering around menacingly with a large spanner. And whenever the alternative view to his own is discussed, we see people doing things that are instantly desirable things to do. Anyway, but it seems to me that there's a certain privileging of endpoint here in Craig's thought. There seems to be a presumption that if a given activity or life doesn't lead to something that lasts forever, then it must be completely valueless, or ultimately valueless anyway. But that just isn't prima facie, it seems, true of all things. So if I said to you, look, I'm going to play this piece by Chopin to you, it'll take about 10 minutes. If you interrupt and say, well, so it's going to end, is it, this piece by Chopin? Well, yeah, but there's really no point in you starting, because there's no point playing it. It could only be valuable, really, if the last note you hit was to go on for an eternity. And that would be a very odd view of the value of me playing this piece by Chopin. This is on the assumption I can't actually play it, but never mind. And I can see that ultimately might make a difference here, but will it end? Well, yes, after about 10 minutes. Well, then ultimately it's valueless. But then I think that sort of plays on a slight ambiguity, confusing two senses of ultimacy. Ultimately meaning what happens temporally at the end, or perhaps just after the end of something, and ultimately meaning most fundamentally or intrinsically. And so that my playing this piece by Chopin will finish in 10 minutes means that at the end, or just after the end of playing it, well, then its value will cease. So it's ultimately, in that sense, temporally in the future, there'll come a time at which it has no more value. Okay, that might be true. But that doesn't mean that it's ultimately in the sense of fundamentally or intrinsically valueless whilst I'm doing it. It might be valuable. It would be if I could play the piano and I played it well and you enjoyed the piece and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that some actions have value only if they result in an outcome. They have value only as a means to an end. So if you take away the end, then the value of the action is taken away. They're only instrumentally valuable. But some actions are intrinsically worth doing. They have value in and for themselves. Kant thought that all moral activity was of that nature. And then whatever happens at the end, it can't take away that intrinsic value. And some actions only have instrumental value, but the outcome is achieved in a finite lifetime. And so nothing that happens afterwards can take away that achievement. So I think that this privileging of the end point, saying that only if value has value in this temporally everlasting fashion can it be true value or something. There's a lot in there that most atheists, again, and indeed some theists such as myself, are going to disagree with and say, no, things can have value even because they're intrinsically valuable, or because they're aimed at outcomes which are worthy of being achieved and which are achieved even in our finite lifetimes.
But it gets even more distressing. For if life ends in the grave, it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as Joseph Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. If your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior, then you may as well just live as you please. Moral values are either just expressions of personal taste or else the byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? Now think of what that means. It means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil.
So Craig says at one stage, he said, but it gets even more distressing. And then you get this sort of, whether you live as Mother Teresa or Joseph Stalin makes no difference. But that's not true on his own account. On his own account, it makes a relative difference, i.e. difference in the lifetimes of the people it affects, even if not in a super long term because of the heat death. So I think that some people will say, yeah, but that's still making a difference, and it's quite important, isn't it? As it were, if your loved one I phoned you up on the side of the road, and your loved one, I say, he's just had a terrible accident, would have died had I not been there to administer life-saving medical treatment, but I'm pleased to say I've stabilised the condition. They will now live, and I've just seen them onto the ambulance, and they're going to be waiting for you at the hospital. You might want to rush there. It'd be very odd if you said, oh, okay, so hang on, what's the ultimate outcome? Ultimately, they're still going to die, aren't they? So if I've got nothing to thank you for, why are you bothering? I mean, sure, it's not, in the end, they're still going to die, but they've got, depending on how old your loved one is, they've now got many decades perhaps left as a result of my intervention. Surely I've contributed value. Surely you've got something to thank me for. Surely I should ride as a course of sin, but I should be pleased with myself. That's quite an achievement that I've managed to do today if I've managed to save someone's life. So I think there's a bit of a hole there. And then there's another non sequitur, it seems to me, because Craig seems to say that it follows from what he said so far that if death is the end, then value is just an expression of personal taste or else the byproduct of evolution. And I've got that jotted down. And then the visual cue suggests one might as well take up shoplifting or being a white supremacist again. Do I want to be a shoplifter and a white supremacist? If not, perhaps I better agree with Craig, but which I don't think is entirely fair. But there are views, and we've referred to them already, incoherent ones, which say values are objective, and that's quite compatible with death being the end. So Tim Scanlon, contemporary philosopher, is retired now, but was a contemporary philosopher, thinks that one can say condemn Stalin and praise Mother Teresa. There are objective values. Stalin didn't respond positively to them. Mother Teresa did. And if you asked him, well, what about the fact that on your view we're all going to die in the end and that'll be it? He'd say, well, I don't see that fact as relevant. Also, I expect, I'm not aware of Scanlon's ever engaged with that type of thought.
Now think of what that means. It means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. To kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent. Our predicament is that it is impossible to live consistently and happily with such a worldview.
But when Craig says to kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent, just doesn't follow from death being the end. It might follow if one added in a certain other premise, for example, the premise that the value of an action is solely determined by its effects on the end state of the universe. Nothing else makes an action have value other than its end state on the universe. But that's a background premise that he never foregrounds, and for good reason. One might think dialectically in that it's really implausible. And now, of course, what he says, well, hang on, I remember something that you can't have any value at all that's objective if God doesn't exist. Oh, all right then. So it's not really that we're all going to die. It's that's doing the work here. Is that you can't have objective value at all if God doesn't exist. Well, all right then. That's your Euthyphro dilemma argument, which I understand has already been treated by another guest to your show. So there is that premise that he's probably relying on.
The atheist philosopher Berton Russell held that moral values are simply expressions of personal taste. And yet Russell admitted that he could not live that way. He therefore found his own worldview, and I quote, incredible. I do not know the solution, he confessed.
Now, it's not terribly significant, but he just gets something wrong here, which I'm pleased with myself having found out. So I'm going to tell you about it. So Russell is said, you may remember at one stage, to believe that moral values are merely expressions of taste. And Craig says personal taste, suggesting that Russell thought that values were subjective to each individual person, whereas Russell's view was an intersubjectivist one. You might think, oh, what does that mean? Well, it's that subjects get together and collectively feel a certain way about things. That generates a standard which is objective relative to any individual opinion, but not as objective as Craig thinks it needs to be objective, similar to Hume, if you're familiar with Hume's thought. So then Craig makes a claim that Russell admitted that he could not live that way. And that struck me as a very surprising thing for Russell to have said. And what was even more surprising was that Russell, according to Craig said, he said it of his own worldview, that it was, and I quote, and this is meant to be a quote of Russell's, incredible, full stop. I do not know the solution. So I'm no expert on Russell, but what I do know of him made me think it's really unlikely that Russell would have said of his own worldview that it was incredible. I do not know the solution. And Craig didn't give a reference. So I did what I imagine anybody would do nowadays. I just typed the phrase, incredible, full stop, I do not know the solution, into a search engine, hoping to find it in content. And I found that the same truncated quotation, incredible, full stop, I do not know the solution, occurs online in a number of places, used to evidence the thought that Russell found his own worldview incredible. Oh, okay. And in his own written piece, which we referenced, The Absurdity of Life Without God, Craig uses it in the same way as he does in the video. And he does there give a reference to Berton Russell, Letter to the Observer, 6th of October, 1957. So I thought, well, how am I going to go and check that to find a particular edition of a British magazine from 65 years ago? I couldn't very well do that, but I knew someone who could. So my college librarian, Dr. David Johnson, thank you very much, he was able to locate for me a copy of that particular edition of this particular British magazine, which viewers in the US probably have never heard of. But there was no letter by Russell in it at all. What was in there was a review of Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian, by Philip Toynbee. And in that book that Toynbee's reviewing of Russell's, there's a transcript of a famous radio debate between Russell and Copleston, where Russell is attacked by Copleston on his intersubjectivity. And the text of that debate is actually also freely available free of charge online. And if you go to the end of the text, you'll see the relevant interchange. And if you read that transcript, you'll see that Russell is absolutely sticking his chin out and taking it about his intersubjectivism. So he wiggles a little bit, but Copleston is really pressing him to the effect of, come on, Russell, if your sort of intersubjectivism is right, you can't say that the commandant of Belsen, i.e. a Nazi mass murderer, you can't say of him that he was objectively evil. But surely you want to say that, Russell, come on. And Russell just in the end bites the bullet and demurs from saying that he was objectively bad, thereby it seems to be maintaining his consistency. I mean, because I had that in mind, I thought, Russell's not going to admit that his own, if Copleston pushed him that hard and in the end he didn't want to say this. So that was a bit odd. But anyway, I thought, well, where did Craig get this quotation from? And what was Russell talking about in it? But I owe the answer to my colleague, David Johnson. And he found that in the following week's edition of The Observer, so not the one that Craig cites as the reference, it's the 13th of October, Russell does have a letter printed. And in that letter, it's responding to Toynbee's review. And he does indeed end the letter with the words that Craig quoted. Incredible, full stop. I do not know the solution. But in context, these words have a very different meaning from that which Craig attributes to them, okay? So according to Russell in that letter, why is he writing this letter in about the review that's been published in the previous? Well, he thinks that Toynbee's misunderstood one aspect of what he's saying, and as he says, it calls for an explanation on one point. And his point is that Toynbee had read Russell as enthusiastic about certain predictions that Russell was making. So just empirical predictions, the future's going to go this way. And Russell says in this letter, quote, the kind of suggestions that horrify Mr. Toynbee are abhorrent to me. It's not that I'm enthusiastic about them. Sorry, that end quote. It's not that he's enthusiastic about them. Russell tells us that he was, quote, engaged not in advocacy, but in prophecy in the style of Cassandra, quote. And then Russell spends the letter saying that it may be hard to believe these awful predictions. They may be, in that sense, incredible, astoundingly awful, undesirable. But according to Russell, well, they're just going to happen, and he doesn't know how to stop them. So in that sense, what he predicts is incredible, but he doesn't know the solution. So to be clear, he's not speaking of his own worldview, and he's not saying that it's incredible, I do not know the solution. He's speaking about these predictions and saying they're incredible just in the sense of astonishingly awful, and he doesn't know how to stop them. So it's a bit as if I said in a book, Trump is going to be the next president of the US. You then wrote a review of that book in which you said, Tim's a keen supporter of Trump for the presidency. I then wrote a letter into the place that published the review and said, no, I'm not advocating for it. I'm just predicting it. I know, just look at the polls. I know, I don't know how you guys are going to vote for him again, but you are. It's incredible. I don't know the solution. And then Craig, reading that letter, had said, oh, Tim has admitted that his own worldview is incredible and he doesn't know the solution. He can't live that way. Which, no, I wasn't saying that at all. So on my view and Craig's, as a point of agreement, Russell's intersubjectivism is rationally indefensible. But I just think it's just wrong as a matter of the history of ideas to say that Russell himself noticed that. And certainly Craig's quoted passage gives us no reason to think that Russell noticed that. Because in its context, which you could never find by looking solely at Craig's work, but which, thanks to David Johnson, I was able to find, Russell is making a very different point with those words. So that's why I feel, okay, I'm no fan of Russell in a load of ways, but I think that he's really got that bit wrong. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a pedantic point in a way. It doesn't maybe affect his point, but Russell it does affect that point, but his main thrust is not affected by the fact he's misattributed the view to Russell. But Russell himself never admitted that his view was inconsistent, that he didn't have a solution to it.
If death stands with open arms at the end of life's trail, then what is the goal of life? Is there no reason for life? If its destiny is a cold death in the recesses of outer space, then the answer is yes, it is pointless. We need to wake up and understand the gravity of the alternatives before us. If God exists, then there is hope for man. But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. Faced with an atheistic worldview, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre realized that life is absurd. In his play, No Exit, he tragically portrayed the life of man as hell. The final words of the play might serve as an atheistic mantra. Well, let's get on with it.
So Sartre's play No Exit, you'll remember, or more literally Behind Closed Doors, but No Exit is a very good translation of it. I think that's how it is translated in English. Is quoted. I should think you should note again, this is a bit pedantic. Well, it's not technically, as Craig says, a depiction of, quote, the life of man, as Craig says. It's actually a depiction of the afterlife of man in hell, or afterlife of three people, two of whom are women, as I would call it, and one man in hell. But it does concern three characters who are shown into a room by a fourth, who then leaves. And this room is going to be their hell. And they're initially surprised to find that, so far, no instruments of torture. In fact, on the contrary, as I would call it, it's relatively well appointed in the French style. I think one of them says that sofas are hideous at one stage, but you might think, well, this is a great place to spend an eternity, and we've got one another for company. But then their relationships between the three of them, they don't know each other prior to entering the room. Their relationship between the three of them becomes, in the vernacular, increasingly toxic, hence, in the end, causing one of the characters to utter the most famous line from the play, "Hell is other people." And the hell is that there's no escape, no exit. The horror is that this toxic relationship of them it's going to go on forever and ever. So one could read an implication of the play, this would be a bit dense, but one could read an implication of the play as being that an everlasting afterlife spent in anyone's company would in the end become toxic, hellish, and thus death without an afterlife, the very thing Craig would say renders our existence an absurdity, is actually an exit. The exit that they can't find, an exit from what would otherwise be an intolerable, everlasting, hellish existence. So one could say that Sartre foreshadows in dramatic form an argument which then Bernard Williams presented in analytic form later on. As I say, that's a bit tenuous, but I thought it was an interesting sort of interpretive angle. And anyway, but then Craig finishes by quoting the final words of the play in translation, "Oh, well, let's get on with it, et bien continuons." And he says that it would well serve as an atheistic mantra. And I think there's truth in that. Although I wouldn't tie the thought to Sartre, I'd say that if atheism is true, it's not that there's no meaning, no value, no purpose. I think you could be an atheist and consistently say there's objective meaning, value, not objective purpose to humanity as such, probably, but objective purpose to each of our lives individually if we engage in the right way with objectively valuable purposes. But just on balance, probably there's going to be less meaning, value and purpose than if atheism is true. And given that, if atheism is true, one might as well, as it were, get on with it. It being adding value to the less than ideal world that we find ourselves in. But then if theism is true, one might as well say, well, let's get on with it. It's, again, being adding value to the best of our ability in the less than ideal world that we find ourselves in. And if one's an agnostic, one might say, well, indeed, let's get on with it. The project of leading the best lives we can in the less than ideal world we find ourselves in. So I did think Craig was right. It's, oh, well, let's get on with it. In context, it might be something the atheist could say, but it did strike me that it's something the theist could say and also something an agnostic could say. So it doesn't particularly serve as an atheist mantra in the sense of distinguish the atheist from the theist or the agnostic. Because who doesn't want to, in the end, say, oh, come on, let's get on with making the best of a bad job, or even if the universe isn't a bad job, the best of a less than ideal world. That's what I believe I'm called to by God. That's what I believe I'm called to by objective value. That's what I don't know if I'm called to by God and or objective value, says the agnostic. But in any case, that's what we're all called to do. So I thought we could all agree with that mantra that Craig offers up for the atheist's endorsement at the end.
I hope you see that Dr. Craig's view about the relationship between God and the meaning of life depends heavily on Dr. Craig's view about the relationship between God and morality. Craig thinks that if God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values and duties. That's actually the first premise of his moral argument for God. If you want to hear a theist who specializes in ethics critique Dr. Craig's moral argument, then I've got just the video for you. It's right here. Go ahead, click it. You know you want to.